Footsteps on marble used to mean money. Tonight, they meant death. Clinton bought a husband to be a pathetic, invisible shield. A broke guy with a toddler and stains on his collar. She didn't know the man warming her bed used to burn down cartels for a living. The boardroom smelled of ozone, burnt espresso, and expensive anxiety. Clinton Hayes sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, watching the ink dry on the non-disclosure agreement. Across from her sat Amory. He wasn't looking at the contract. He was looking at the damp, chewed-up corner of a plush rabbit clutched in his left hand, while his right hand gently rocked a battered stroller back and forth over the imported Persian rug. The wheels squeaked. A tiny, rhythmic sound that was driving Clinton's legal team insane. Amory Myers did not belong here. He wore a navy suit that was 10 years out of date, the shoulders boxing out too far, the fabric shining faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights from too many trips to a cheap dry cleaner. He smelled of Dial soap, baby formula, and the distinct stale exhaust of public transit. Clinton, by contrast, was wrapped in bespoke cashmere, radiating the faint scent of bergamot and ruthlessness. "The terms are absolute, Mr. Myers," Clinton said. Her voice was flat, practiced. She had spent a decade stripping the warmth from her vocal cords to survive the tech sector. "You get $2 million deposited into a trust for the boy's medical expenses. You get a residence, a stipend. In exchange, you are my husband in the eyes of the public, the board, and the press. You smile. You stand slightly behind me. You do not speak to reporters, and you never, under any circumstances, ask me about my business." Amory stopped rocking the stroller. He looked up. His eyes were a washed-out, exhausted gray. There were deep, bruised shadows beneath them. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 years. "I don't care about your business," Amory said. His voice was gravelly, quiet. "The trust fund. It unlocks immediately." The moment the ink on the marriage certificate is dry, Clinton's lead counsel snapped, annoyed by the man's lack of deference. Amory nodded once, a sharp, mechanical motion. He picked up the Mont Blanc pen. It looked absurdly small in his thick, heavily calloused fingers. He signed his name without reading the final page. Clinton felt a brief, uncomfortable twist in her stomach. Not guilt. Clinton didn't do guilt. It was more like the friction of witnessing a creature walk willingly into a trap. She needed a husband because her board of directors was getting restless. She was 32, unmarried, unattached, and entirely consumed by the acquisition of a rare earth mining conglomerate that had made her a lot of dangerous enemies. Her PR team had run the analytics. An untouchable, icy billionaire was a target. A philanthropist who married a destitute single father? That was a human interest story. It made her sympathetic. It provided cover. She had specifically chosen Amory from a pile of vetted candidates because he was the most unremarkable broken man on paper. He had a sick kid, mounting debts, and a resume full of vague warehouse jobs. He was a non-threat. They moved into her penthouse 3 days later. The transition was jarring. Clinton's home was a sterile monument to minimalist wealth glass, brushed steel, white Italian leather. Within hours, it felt contaminated. A brightly colored plastic activity mat appeared in the living room. Bottles of formula lined her quartz kitchen counters. Clinton avoided him. They existed in the same 4,000 square foot space like ghosts. She worked until 2 a.m., drinking scotch and staring at glowing monitors. Amory was usually awake too, but for different reasons. She would hear him pacing the guest hallway, murmuring in a low, rumbling baritone to get the child, Lico, to sleep. One night, she walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. Amory was standing by the island, wearing faded gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt. The shirt clung to him, damp with sweat. He had his back to her, scrubbing a baby bottle in the sink. Clinton stopped. The muscles in his back were shifting beneath the thin cotton, dense and heavily defined. A thick, raised scar peeked out from the collar of his shirt, trailing down his neck and disappearing between his shoulder blades. It didn't look like a surgical scar. It looked jagged, violent. "There's a dishwasher, Amory," she said, her voice sharp. startled by her own sudden hyper-awareness of him. He didn't jump. He didn't even turn around immediately. He finished rinsing the bottle, set it on a towel, and then looked over his shoulder. "He likes it when they're warm right out of the water," Amory said mildly. He grabbed a towel and dried his hands. His knuckles were thick, scarred. "Sorry if I woke you." "I wasn't sleeping." Clinton crossed the room, pouring herself a glass of water from the fridge dispenser. The hum of the appliance filled the silence. She looked at him over the rim of her glass. "You don't ask for much. You haven't touched the stipend." "I have what I need." "Nobody just has what they need," Clinton retorted, her cynicism flaring. She hated people who pretended to be noble. It was always a grift. "You're living in a $50 million penthouse. You can buy yourself a decent watch. Or shirts that don't look like they were pulled from a donation bin. We have a gala on Friday. You need to look the part." Amory looked down at his shirt, then back at her. There was no shame in his eyes, just a profound, empty patience. "I'll wear whatever you tell me to wear, Clinton. Just leave the tag on so I know how much to thank you for it." He walked past her. He didn't smell like Dial soap tonight. He smelled like warm skin and exhaustion. Clinton stood alone in the cold kitchen, irritated by the encounter. He didn't cower. He didn't push back. He just absorbed her venom like a sponge, entirely unfazed. It made her feel small. The benefit dinner for the Metropolitan Museum was a suffocating affair. The room was choked with the smell of orchids, heavy perfumes, and roasting truffles. Clinton hated it. She hated the tight, corseted feeling of her Alexander McQueen gown, and she hated the predatory smiles of the people in the room. Amory stood beside her. He was poured into a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo she had ordered for him. The tailor had complained for an hour about the difficulty of fitting the jacket over Amory's shoulders, muttering about irregular muscle mass. Amory looked stiff. He held his champagne flute delicately, like he was afraid the crystal would shatter in his grip. "Smile," Clinton murmured through her teeth as a photographer walked past. Amory's mouth twitched upward. It was a terrible smile, tight and unconvincing. "Well, well, if it isn't the newlyweds." Clinton suppressed a sigh. Richard walked toward them. Richard was the heir to a telecom fortune, a man with perfect teeth, a flawless tan, and the moral compass of a tapeworm. He had tried to buy Clinton out of her mining deal twice. He had failed twice. "Richard," Clinton said, her voice dropping to a cool, polite register. "Clinton, you look exquisite." Richard's eyes slid to Amory. The disdain in his gaze was immediate and completely unconcealed. And this must be the famous Amory, the philanthropist. "Nice to meet you," Amory said. He extended a hand. Richard looked at the hand, noting the rough texture, the pale scars across the knuckles. He reached out and offered a brief, limp shake. "Fascinating grip you have there, Amory. What was it you did before you won the matrimonial lottery?" "Logistics, was it?" "Warehouse management," Amory said evenly. Richard chuckled. It was a wet, unpleasant sound. Warehouse management, moving boxes. How wonderfully grounded. It must be quite a shock, moving from pallets to caviar. "Has Clinton taught you which fork to use yet?" "I know the transition can be taxing." Clinton felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger in her chest. It surprised her. She didn't care about Amory. He was an employee, a prop, but Richard's smugness felt like a direct insult to her property. She opened her mouth to cut Richard down, but Amory spoke first. "I usually just watch what Clinton does and follow along," Amory said. His voice was totally devoid of sarcasm. It was genuine, humble, pathetic. "It's a lot to learn." Richard beamed, validated. "Well, keep your head down, old boy. Try not to break anything expensive." He winked at Clinton. "A bold PR move, Clinton." "Really? Adopting a stray? Very chic this season." Richard drifted away into the crowd. Clinton turned on Amory, her fingernails digging into her palms. "Why did you just stand there and take that?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the surrounding guests wouldn't hear. Amory looked at her, his expression blank. "Take what?" "The insult, the condescension. You practically rolled over and exposed your belly. Clinton's heart was hammering against her ribs. "You are my husband. When someone insults you, they insult me. I don't pay you to be a doormat." Amory took a slow sip of his champagne. He swallowed, looking out over the crowded room. "He's a man in a silk suit drinking overpriced wine, Clinton. His words don't mean anything. He's not a threat. Why would I waste energy getting angry at a ghost?" "He's not a ghost. He's a board member at—" "He's soft," Amory interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. For a fraction of a second, the exhaustion in his gray eyes vanished, replaced by something cold, heavy, and terrifyingly dense. It felt like looking down the barrel of a loaded weapon. People like that talk because they've never had their teeth kicked down their throat for speaking out of turn. "Let him talk. It costs me nothing." Clinton froze. The air between them suddenly felt thin. She stared at him, trying to reconcile the broken, exhausted father with the man standing in front of her. But the flash of darkness was already gone. Amory blinked, and the tired, slumped posture returned. "Do you want me to get you another drink?" he asked softly. "No," Clinton said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to go home." The ride back to the penthouse was silent. The city lights bled through the tinted windows of the Maybach, washing the leather interior in flashes of neon and sodium orange. Clinton sat pressed against the far door, watching Amory's reflection in the glass. He had his phone out. He was watching a silent video of Liko giggling in a bathtub. He was an enigma. And Clinton hated puzzles she couldn't solve. At 3:14 a.m., the ambient hum of the penthouse died. Clinton woke with a start. The transition from sleep to waking was violent. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The heavy, forced-air HVAC system had stopped. The digital clock on her nightstand was black. Total power failure. In a building with 3 redundant backup generators, that was a statistical impossibility. Clinton pushed herself up on her elbows. The air in the room felt thick. She reached for her phone. The screen illuminated her face with a harsh blue glow. No service. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced her stomach. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She walked toward the bedroom door, reaching for the heavy brass handle. A hand clamped over her mouth. Clinton screamed against the palm, her body thrashing backward, her nails clawing blindly. An arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet, hauling her backward into the shadows of her walk-in closet. "Stop," a voice breathed into her ear. It was Amory. "Stop fighting. It's me." He lowered her to the floor. The closet was pitch black. Clinton was hyperventilating, her chest heaving against the silk of her nightgown. She could smell him sweat and something metallic. "What are you doing?" she gasped, swatting his hand away. "The power!" They cut the hard lines in the basement, jammed the cellular frequencies. Amory's voice was completely different. The soft, tired gravel was gone. It was a clipped, clinical whisper. 3 men, maybe 4. They bypassed the biometric locks on the private elevator. They're on the lower level right now. Clinton's brain struggled to process the words. "What? How do you—" "No, my security team." "Your security team in the lobby is dead," Amory stated. "Not a guess, a fact. The men downstairs are carrying suppressed weapons. I heard the bolt slide on a compact rifle. They aren't here to rob you, Clinton. They're moving systematically. They're here to clean house." Clinton felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs turned to water. She sank against the cedar panels of the closet. All her life, she had built fortresses of money, legal contracts, and corporate leverage. None of it mattered. A piece of paper couldn't stop a bullet. She was going to die in a closet. "Liko," she choked out. "He's safe. I put him in the reinforced panic room off the kitchen behind the pantry when I heard the power cut," Amory said. Clinton stared into the dark. You moved him before you came for me?" "I had to secure the liability," Amory said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Stay here. Do not make a sound. If I don't come back in 4 minutes, lock this door from the inside and press the silent panic button under the jewelry island. It runs on an isolated battery. It'll alert the police." "Amory, wait!" Clinton grabbed his forearm. The muscle beneath his skin was tense, hard as iron. "What are you going to do? They have guns. You can't." Amory didn't answer. He just pulled his arm away. The closet door opened a fraction, letting in a sliver of moonlight from the bedroom windows, and then clicked shut. Clinton was alone. The silence was agonizing. She pressed her face against the slats of the closet door, peering out into the bedroom. She could see the hallway beyond her open bedroom door. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a shadow detached itself from the wall in the hallway. The man was dressed in tactical black, wearing a plate carrier and a balaclava. He held a suppressed submachine gun tight against his shoulder, sweeping the barrel across the dark hallway. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace. A professional, he stepped into Clinton's bedroom. Amory didn't drop from the ceiling. He didn't yell. He simply appeared from the blind spot behind the heavy oak door. He didn't have a gun. He had a heavy, solid brass floor lamp he had unscrewed from its base. The assassin didn't even have time to turn. Amory stepped into the man's guard, entirely ignoring the weapon. His left hand shot out, not to strike, but to grab the barrel of the gun, forcing it violently upward. A muffled foot echoed as 3 rounds tore into the ceiling plaster. Simultaneously, Amory brought the heavy brass pole down on the side of the man's knee. There was a sickening wet crack. The man buckled, a strangled gasp escaping his mask. Amory didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. As the man fell forward, Amory dropped the brass pole, wrapped his arm around the back of the man's neck, and drove his own knee up into the center of the assassin's face. The crunch of cartilage was deafening in the quiet room. The man went limp, hitting the floor like a sack of wet cement. Amory rode him to the ground, keeping his hand clamped over the man's mouth to muffle any groans, pressing his knee into the man's spine. He held him there for 5 seconds until the twitching stopped. Clinton clamped both hands over her mouth to trap a scream. She was shaking violently. The smell hit her, then the sharp, metallic tang of hot blood mixed with the sudden, foul odor of voided bowels. The dead man had soiled himself. Amory stood up. He didn't look at the body. He picked up the suppressed submachine gun, checked the chamber with a quick, practiced flick of his thumb, and stripped the spare magazine from the dead man's vest. 2 more shadows appeared in the hallway, alerted by the muffled shots. Amory didn't take cover. He stepped directly out of the bedroom, into the fatal funnel of the doorway, raising the weapon. He didn't spray. He didn't fire in panic. Foot. 2 trigger pulls. 2 soft, metallic coughs. 1 shadow dropped instantly, falling backward into a glass console table in the hall. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, a cascade of sharp noise that tore through the penthouse. The second shadow returned fire. Plaster exploded off the walls around Amory. Clinton shrieked as a stray bullet tore through the bedroom wall, embedding itself in the ceiling above the closet. Amory didn't flinch. He didn't dive out of the way. He took a half-step forward, squared his shoulders, and fired twice more. The gunfire stopped. A heavy thud echoed from the hallway. Then, silence. Only the sound of the wind, rattling the heavy glass panes of the windows. Clinton couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt paralyzed. She waited for the sound of more boots. She waited for Amory to fall. Instead, the closet door opened. Amory stood there. His white t-shirt was splattered with dark, wet spots. His face was entirely relaxed. The exhausted, stooped father was gone. The man standing in front of her was an apex predator, vibrating with a cold, terrifying kinetic energy. His eyes were wide, dilated, absorbing every detail of the room. "They're dead," Amory said. His voice was steady. His heart rate didn't even sound elevated. Clinton looked past him. The body of the first man lay in a pool of dark liquid on her expensive rug. Clinton felt the sudden, uncontrollable surge of nausea. She turned her head, leaned over, and violently vomited onto the cedar floor of the closet. She gagged, her whole body shuddering, trying to expel the horror of what she had just witnessed. Amory knelt beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer comforting words. He just waited for her to finish. When she finally stopped, wiping her mouth with a trembling hand, she looked up at him. Tears of sheer terror streaked her face. "Who?" she choked, her voice breaking. "What are you?" Amory looked at the gun in his hand. He engaged the safety and set it on the floor. The exhaustion began to creep back into his posture, his shoulders slumping, the terrifying light in his eyes dimming back to that washed-out gray. "I told you, Clinton," he said softly, staring at the blood on his hands. "I did logistics. I cleaned up messes. You just didn't ask what kind." Nausea came in unpredictable, shuddering waves. Clinton sat on the edge of the guest bed, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket that did nothing to stop her teeth from chattering. The penthouse was freezing. A shattered floor-to-ceiling pane in the hallway let in the biting October wind, carrying the distant wail of traffic from the streets below. Amory was working. He hadn't called the police. Instead, he had produced a cheap burner cell phone from the bottom of his duffel bag and made a 30-second phone call. Then, he went to the utility room. Clinton watched him from the doorway, her mind completely detached from reality. She watched her destitute, pathetic husband drag 3 grown men onto thick, heavy-duty painter's tarps. He didn't grunt with the effort. He moved them like they were sacks of grain. He stripped their tactical vests, removed their weapons, and piled the brass shell casings into a small, neat mound on the glass coffee table. The sound of his heavy boots crunching over shattered glass was the only noise in the apartment. When a private elevator pinged 20 minutes later, Clinton flinched, pulling the blanket up to her chin. 4 men in unmarked gray overalls stepped out. They didn't speak. They brought heavy plastic bins, industrial mops, and jugs of enzymatic cleaner. Amory handed the lead man a black canvas bag containing the weapons. Money exchanged hands, thick, banded stacks Clinton had never seen before. In less than an hour, the bodies were gone. The glass was swept. The bullet holes in the drywall were spackled over with a fast-drying compound. The cleaners left like a receding tide, taking the horror with them. Only the smell remained. Ammonia, ozone, and a faint, lingering ghost of copper. Amory walked into the guest room. He had finally changed out of the blood-splattered t-shirt. He wore a heavy gray sweater. He held a mug of chamomile tea. He extended it to her. Clinton looked at his hands. The rough, calloused knuckles. She froze in seconds, so entirely overwhelmed by the proximity of a man who had just casually snapped a human spine that her lungs simply forgot to expand. She couldn't take the mug. If she touched him, she felt she might burn. "Drink it," Amory said gently. He set it on the nightstand. "It'll help with the shock." "Who did you call?" Clinton's voice was a harsh, rasping whisper. "Who were those people?" "Independent contractors. They specialize in discreet waste management." Amory sat on the edge of a velvet armchair across from the bed. He rested his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. He looked exhausted again. The terrifying kinetic energy had drained out of him, leaving the familiar, stooped father behind. "You're a murderer," Clinton said. The words tasted like ash. Amory didn't flinch. "I was an extraction specialist. I worked for an agency that didn't exist, doing things the government couldn't legally do, usually targeting cartel operations south of the border. When diplomacy fails, they send people like me to burn the house down." Clinton stared at him. The absurdity of it all was suffocating. And the warehouse jobs? The debt? Cover. You don't walk away from that life with a pension and a golden watch, Clinton. You walk away with a target on your back. You bury your money, you bury your identity, and you become invisible. "Why?" Clinton demanded, a sudden, sharp anger piercing through her terror. "If you were so dangerous, why become a pathetic, broken charity case? Why let men like Richard Trent humiliate you?" Amory looked away. He looked toward the hallway, where the panic room was. "Because of Lico." Clinton stopped. "My last stop was a compound outside Sinaloa," Amory said, his voice flattening into a dead, monotone drone. "We were supposed to clear it. No survivors. Standard cartel wipe. I breached a back bedroom. There was a woman dead on the floor. And a kid in a crib. He was crying. He had asthma. His lips were blue." Amory looked back at Clinton. His gray eyes were entirely stripped of defense. They were raw, bruised, and profoundly sad. I couldn't pull the trigger, Amory whispered. I put my gun down. I wrapped him in a blanket. I shot my commanding officer in the knee when he tried to stop me, and I walked into the jungle. He rubbed a hand over his face. The medical bills for his lungs drained what little clean cash I had. I needed the $2 million you offered. I needed him safe. If that meant letting a trust fund idiot insult me at a party, it was a cheap price to pay. Clinton sat in the silence, processing the sheer weight of his reality. She had spent her entire adult life manipulating people, finding their levers, their price tags. She thought she had bought a prop, a shield. Instead, she had bought a weapon that had just saved her life. They were after me, Clinton said softly, the realization finally settling into her bones. The mining deal. Richard. Yes, Amory said. They won't stop. If they sent a hit squad, they'll send another. I have to call my lawyers. I have to call the board. Clinton started to stand, the familiar corporate panic setting in. No, Amory said. The gravel was back in his voice. He stood up. He wasn't stooped anymore. Lawyers can't stop bullets, Clinton. You don't fight men like this with injunctions. You fight them with fear. Clinton looked up at him. What are you going to do? I'm going to pack a bag for Lico. I'm taking him to a secure location I set up in Vermont. Amory walked toward the door, pausing at the frame. He looked over his shoulder. Then, I'm going to have a conversation with Richard. Richard Trent's private office occupied the entire top floor of the Trent Telecommunications building. It was a monument to unearned ego, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Manhattan, leather couches imported from Milan, and a massive mahogany desk that looked like a runway. At 7 a.m., Richard was pouring himself a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, humming a tuneless melody. He was waiting for a phone call. A phone call that would confirm Clinton Hayes had tragically perished in a home invasion, leaving the rare earth mining acquisition entirely vulnerable to his hostile takeover. The heavy double doors of his office didn't open. They burst inward with a deafening splintering of oak. Richard dropped his glass. It shattered, orange juice pooling on the white rug. Amory walked into the room. He didn't look like a warehouse worker today. He wore his faded gray sweatpants and a dark jacket, but it was the way he moved that paralyzed Richard. There was no hesitation, no shuffling. Amory crossed the 60 feet of the office in seconds, radiating a dense, suffocating violence. "Security!" Richard screamed, backpedaling so fast he hit the edge of his desk. "Security! Get in here!" "Your private security detail on the ground floor is currently zip-tied to the plumbing in the utility basement," Amory said casually. He didn't yell. His voice was conversational, which somehow made it infinitely worse. "The cameras are looping. The phones are dead." Amory reached Richard. He didn't throw a punch. He simply reached out, grabbed the lapels of Richard's $5,000 suit, and lifted the man off his feet. Richard kicked, choking, his perfectly tanned face turning a splotchy, ugly red. Amory slammed him back onto the mahogany desk, sweeping a bronze sculpture and 2 monitors onto the floor with a violent crash. He leaned over Richard, pressing his forearm against the billionaire's throat, just hard enough to restrict the airway but not crush the windpipe. "Let's talk about investments, Richard," Amory whispered. Richard clawed at Amory's arm, his eyes bulging. He smelled the faint odor of ammonia and gunpowder on Amory's clothes. The realization hit him like a freight train. The hit squad hadn't failed because of Clinton's guards. They had failed because of the stray dog she had married. "You sent 3 men to my house?" Amory said. His gray eyes were black pits. "They broke my wife's table. They woke up my son. I consider that incredibly rude." I don't know," Richard wheezed. Amory pressed harder. The cartilage in Richard's throat clicked. "Do not insult my intelligence," Amory murmured. "I pulled the burner phone off your team leader. I saw the encrypted texts. I know the routing numbers you used to pay them." Amory leaned in closer. The terrifying, cold machinery of his past was fully engaged. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a natural disaster in a cheap jacket. "Here is the new reality, Richard," Amory said, his tone utterly flat. "Clinton's mining deal goes through without a single roadblock. You drop your bids. You drop your public objections. If I read an article in the journal suggesting you even sighed heavily at a board meeting about her, I will come back." Amory released the pressure on Richard's throat slightly, letting the man drag in a wet, ragged breath. "I won't send a hit squad," Amory continued softly. "I don't need to. I will walk through your front door, I will bypass your security, and I will drown you in your own swimming pool. And the police will write it up as a tragic, drunken accident. Do you understand the physics of what I am explaining to you?" Richard was crying. Genuine, pathetic tears of absolute terror leaked from the corners of his eyes, tracking through his expensive moisturizer. He nodded frantically, a jerky, desperate motion. Amory stared at him for 3 long seconds. The disgust in his eyes was profound. "Good," Amory said. He let go of the suit. Richard scrambled backward across the desk, falling off the other side and curling into a ball on the floor, gasping for air. Amory didn't look back. He adjusted his jacket, walked over the broken glass and spilled juice, and walked out the door. Clinton was standing by the window of her penthouse when she heard the front door open. The glass had been replaced by emergency glaziers. The rugs had been chemically treated. Outwardly, the fortress was restored. Inwardly, everything had shifted. Amory walked into the living room. He looked exhausted. He dropped a set of keys on the console table. "It's done," Amory said quietly. "Richard won't be a problem anymore. Your deal will clear tomorrow." Clinton turned around. She looked at him. The cheap jacket, the tired posture, the man who had slaughtered 3 assassins and terrified a billionaire titan into submission just to secure a trust fund for a toddler. "You didn't kill him," Clinton said. "No." Amory walked into the kitchen and turned on the tap, washing his hands. "Killing him creates a power vacuum. It invites police. Fear is a better investment. It yields long-term dividends." Clinton slowly walked into the kitchen. She leaned against the marble island. She had spent millions building walls of legal protection, PR spin, and corporate leverage. It was all fragile. It was all an illusion. True power wasn't a bank account. True power was the man drying his hands with a dish towel right in front of her. "You're leaving," Clinton said. It wasn't a question. Amory stopped. He draped the towel over the sink. The contract was for optics. "You don't need optics anymore. You need distance. I'm a liability." Clinton felt a strange, tight pulling sensation in her chest. It wasn't logic. It wasn't strategy. It was a deeply human, deeply raw panic at the thought of the penthouse returning to its sterile, quiet state. She thought about the squeaking stroller wheels, the baby bottles in the sink, the terrifying absolute safety of his presence in the dark. "The contract stipulates a minimum of 2 years of public cohabitation," Clinton said, her voice finding its familiar icy corporate edge, though it trembled slightly. "If you breach it, the trust fund is technically void." Amory slowly turned around. He looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Clinton, I just solved your problem. I'm giving you an out. You don't want a killer in your house." "I decide what I want in my house," Clinton snapped, crossing her arms defensively, masking her vulnerability with authority. She looked down at the floor, then back up at his tired, battered face. "The guest room gets terrible light. We can move the crib into the master suite. There's plenty of space." Amory stared at her. For the first time since she had met him, the ghost of a genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't tight. It wasn't forced. It was just incredibly, profoundly human. "The master suite," Amory repeated softly. "And buy a new suit," Clinton added, turning away to hide the sudden flush in her cheeks, her voice dropping to a softer cadence. "Please, for both our sakes." Amory watched her walk toward the hallway, the heavy silence of the penthouse finally feeling less like a tomb and more like a home. "Whatever you say, boss," he murmured. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a badass twist, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on our daily suspenseful stories. Drop a comment below. What would you do if your fake husband turned out to be a secret weapon? See you next time.